this lesson we are going to be looking at the circular flow and quantitative elements. Okay? And then what we now know is that our circular flow is generally an open economy. Is that correct? Okay, and what was the difference that we noted from between an open economy and a closed economy? What was the difference? What is the difference between open economy and a closed economy? An open economy has more participants than a closed economy. Yes. What else do we now know about a circular flow? Circular, open, closed. What else do we now know about a circular flow, open and closed? Yes? The open economy includes the foreign sector. In other words, what we now know is, in our circular flow model, the open economy is going to include trade with other countries. Is that correct? It includes trade with other countries. Now, let me just take you back a little bit. When we looked at our closed economy, we noted that this is when the amount of expenditure or buying of goods and services is going to be done within the borders of a country. Is that correct? This is where businesses, South African businesses, were not trading with any other business which is outside South Africa. In other words, it excluded the foreign sector. That was our closed economy. Is that correct? And then it meant that we were going to be having the aggregate expenditure or aggregate components for domestic economy. We were going to have our household. It included our household consumption. It also included government spending, our G, is that correct? It also included what? Investment spending by our businesses, local businesses. These were the aggregate expenditures for closed economy, a closed circular flow model. It looked at consumption spending by households, it looked at government spending, it also looked at investment spending by businesses. Now, when we look at the open economy now, it meant that we are then going to add our minus our M. Now, the question that comes to mind is, what does X stand for? Exports. Exports. X is our exports, is that correct? Yes. And our M? Imports. So our M is going to be our imports. Now, why are we subtracting M from X? Why are we subtracting X? Why are we subtracting M from our X? Because the M is a leakage, isn't it? But we now know that our M here, it looks at the amount of goods that were bought from other countries into our country. So we have got to exclude that. Why? Because it's not amount of money that was spent in the domestic economy. It's not goods that had been made in our country. It's goods that were brought into our country that were made in other countries. So that amount of money, when we import the goods, it does not necessarily signify the amount of expenditure that was incurred in our domestic economy. Now, what we are calculating here is what is called the gross domestic product, but we are looking at the expenditure method. We are looking at our gross domestic product, but specifically we are looking at our expenditure method. Now, what is gross domestic product? What do we mean when we say gross domestic product? Yes. Very, very correct. In other words, our gross domestic product, it looks at the total value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country for usually a period of 1 year. Are we together? Now, when you look at the expenditure method of calculating our gross domestic product, what we are in principle saying is we are looking at the total value of expenditure that was incurred on goods that had been produced within the borders of a country. The gross domestic product expenditure method should then look at the total value of expenditure that has been incurred on goods and services that were produced within the borders of a country. So when we subtract the M, what we are saying is this expenditure was not on goods that had been manufactured in our country. Is that correct? That's why we are subtracting the M. Because it was expenditure on goods that were manufactured where? Outside the country. Right. Now, when we are calculating the gross domestic product, dear learners, remember, we identified that there are three methods that are used to calculate the gross domestic expenditure. We said the first one is the production method, the second one is the income method, the third one is our expenditure method, which we said it's known as PI. How do we spell our PI? It's our PI. It's the production method, the income method, and the expenditure method. Those are the three methods that are used to value our gross domestic product. You might be asking yourself, why is this important that we value our gross domestic product? Why do we need to value the gross domestic product? Now, the answer to this is very simple. The gross domestic product, remember we said, is the total value of all final goods and services that have been produced within the borders of the country for usually a period of 1 year. Now, the main reason why we need to do these national accounts is it helps us to indicate the economic activity, the level of economic activity in a country. It helps us to establish the level of economic activity in the country. So it helps us to establish the level of economic activity. It also helps us to measure the level of economic growth from 1 year to the other year. In other words, this valuation of the gross domestic product, it helps us to bring comparisons between different years. We are comparing, this year is 2023, and we are comparing 2023 probably to 2022. Are we doing better or we are worse off? And for us to be able to bring that comparison, we are looking at the gross domestic products. Okay? You would also need to understand that it helps us in determining the standards of living. Are the citizens better off or they are worse off? So it helps us, one, to measure the level of economic activity. Number two, it helps us to measure the level of economic growth from 1 year to the other year. Three, it also helps us to determine the standards of living in a country. And then the last most important thing is it also helps us to compare the different levels of prosperity for different countries. We can now compare the different levels of prosperity between countries. In other words, the country that has a higher GDP is generally in economics considered to be a wealthier country. When we look at our GDE, I just want to specifically look at our gross domestic expenditure. We said the gross domestic expenditure is the total expenditure of all sectors of an economy on final goods and services used in that country. We are saying it looks at the final value of all goods and services used in that country, produced in that country. Now, normally consumers and government, they spend money on consumer goods. Is that so? Normally consumers and government, they do spend money on consumer goods and services. And you will find that the firms and the government, they spend money on capital goods as well. So the consumers and the government are going to spend on final goods and services. Remember, in our circular flow we said, businesses, they provide final goods and services to who and who? Government and so we are saying government and households, they spend money on final goods and services in our products market. And then you would also find that government and the businesses, they also spend money on capital goods. They also spend a lot of money on buying capital goods. You would now find that this would now mean that when we are talking about a domestic economy, our GDE for a closed economy is going to be calculated as C plus G plus I. If it is a closed economy, it's going to be calculated as what? As C plus G plus I. If it is an open economy, then we are also going to add our X minus our M. Right? And I want you to note that our C, what does it stand for? Consumption spending by household. So we are going to write C stands for consumption spending by households. Okay? And then our I, what does it stand for?
Investment spending by local businesses.
Yes, investment spending by local businesses. And then our G, government spending. Now, this is our GDP, and we are looking at the E. These are the components of our gross domestic product and looking at our E. When we look at our expenditure method of calculating, okay, the first thing that we are going to look at, remember our expenditure method, we said it's C plus G plus I plus X minus M. So even when you are in an exam and you are given a table, we have what are called data tables. And then we are given a data table and we are told to calculate some value of GDP. This is what economists do. They are going to add the C, which is the consumption spending by households. They add the G, which is the government spending, which they add the I, which is gross capital formation. We call it gross capital formation. This is the amount of money that is spent by businesses on buying capital goods, buying machinery, which they are going to use in the production process. And we call that one gross capital formation. And then the answer that you get there, when you have added the C, the G, the I, are we together there? Is what we call the gross domestic expenditure. Is what we call the gross domestic expenditure. Gross domestic expenditure. Why is it called gross domestic? Why is it domestic? Yes? It's spending that was done within the borders of a country. Are we together there? So it's called domestic because it's expenditure that was done within the borders of our country. So it's gross domestic expenditure when you add these three aggregate components. Then to that now, we now add our exports, and then we now subtract our M, which is our imports. Are we together? And then the answer that you get when you now add the X less the M, the answer that you get is what is called expenditure on GDP at market prices. It's called expenditure on GDP at market price. Expenditure on GDP at market price or prices. In the exam, you are given probably certain components, certain figures are there and certain figures are missing. And then you are told to calculate those figures that are missing. You should understand that the formula for calculating our gross domestic expenditure is going to be C plus G plus I, and the answer that we get there when we add these three components is our gross domestic expenditure. Domestic because it's total expenditure within the borders of a country on goods that were manufactured in the country. And then to this, we are going to add the X, subtract the M. And the answer that you get is what is called expenditure on GDP at market prices. We understand? Right. Then that's our expenditure. Then the production method. Production method. Now, when we look at the production method, we are saying this method is used to calculate GDP by looking at the value that was added of the final goods and services that were produced within the borders of the country, but by sectors of the economy. In other words, we calculate our total value of final goods by looking at the value that was added by individual sectors of the economy. The goods that were produced within the borders of a country, and looking at the value that was added by the individual sectors of the economy. Now, our sectors of the economy, they are generally three. We have the first one, that is the primary sector, we have the secondary sector, and we have the tertiary sector. Now, when we look at the GDP and looking at the production method, we are saying how much was the value that was added by the primary sector in these final goods and services? How much was the value that was added by the secondary sector in these goods and services? How much was the value that was added by our tertiary sector in these final goods and services? Now, you should understand that as a matter of principle, because we are calculating GDP looking at different methods, it's the same thing that we are calculating. So it means whether you use your production, you use your income, you use your expenditure method, the value for GDP should be in principle the same. Right. So in the production method now, remember we are looking at a sector value added. So what you are going to do is, you are going to look at the value that was added by the primary sector plus the value that was added by the secondary sector by primary sector. The primary sector, we are looking at which assets form part of the primary sector, examples of primary sector that we know. Mining, farming, forestry, fisheries, agriculture, you understand? Right, so all those, the value that was added of their output there. We then with the value added by secondary sector. Now, which industries form the secondary sector? Maybe factories, we have the manufacturing, these that are into processing, but in principle we are talking about the manufacturing. Are we together? So what we are saying is, the raw materials have been mined by the primary sector, for example. Let's look at an example maybe of something like diamond, okay? And you want a ring, a diamond ring. So it means the primary sector has extracted the diamond from the earth. Is that correct? The raw diamond. When they do that, they are going to maybe, let's say it was $10. That's the value of the diamond that was mined. Now, the secondary sector is going to manufacture or is going to polish the diamond and they start producing the rings and all those other things that we need. Is that so? Yes. Right. So what they will do is, this was the output from the primary sector, $10. Then the secondary sector added some value to the diamond. They added the value of how much? Probably when the diamond left as a ring, now maybe that ring is now worth $20 or is now worth $30, for example. $30. So how much was the value that was added by the secondary sector? 20. Are we together? So the value added here was 20. So we are saying value added is 20 by the secondary. Why is it 20? Because of course the product is now worth $30. But when we manufactured the product, we had taken $10 from the primary sector. Because we bought these diamonds at $10. And then we added value. By the time we dispatched the diamonds from our secondary sector into tertiary, where we are going to sell the diamonds, it was now valued at 30. So the value that we had added was what? 20. Are you following? Right. And then when the diamond now reaches probably the jeweler shops, they start selling it now as a ring or as a necklace. And then maybe they sell it maybe at $40. This is the final value that is being sold, the ring in the market. Is that correct? So what does that mean? It means the tertiary sector has added $10. Is that correct? Here they added $10 is what they added. Is that correct? Now, let's just look through this. You need to note, dear learners, that when we are talking about the production method, you are not saying 10 from the primary plus 30 from the secondary plus 40 from the tertiary. If you do that, you are going to get a wrong answer. It is because you have double counted. If you do it like that, if you look at what was the value that was produced by the primary, 10 rands, $10. What was the value produced by the secondary? $30. Then you say 10 plus 30, that's 40. What was the value in the tertiary? 40. Then you say it's 80 now, our GDP. It means you have double counted. Because in this $30 here, there is $10 already. Do you understand? In this $40 here, there is already 10 that is included and a 20 that is included. So how much was added by the tertiary sector? It's $10 only. Why are we saying 10? It is because when the tertiary sector ordered the items from the manufacturer, they bought the items at $30. And then they only added $10 on top so that they can sell it at 40. So what is the market price of the ring in the market? It's $40. So what is our GDP? Let's go back to the GDP definition. It's the total value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country for a period of 1 year. What is the total value of the goods and services produced? It's 40. How did we get 40? It's 10 from the primary plus 20 from our secondary plus 10 from our tertiary, which means now that it's 40. This is the total value of goods and services that have been produced within the borders of a country. Now, with our production method, dear learners, you need to understand that we are looking at the value that was added by individual sectors of the economy. So I want us to take note of that. So we are saying, we said primary, secondary, then we added our tertiary. And the value that we get here, this 40 that we have here, is what is called the GDP at basic prices. It's called the GDP at basic prices. Now with our production method, it would now mean that production method, we said it's primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector. When you add all this, when it is added, you get your GDP at basic prices. Is that so? You get your GDP at basic prices. Now to that GDP at basic prices, we now add the taxes on production. We now add taxes on products. Okay? Add taxes on products. Why? Because taxes on products, they increase the value of final goods and services. If the government adds some tax on products like a value added tax, it increases the value. Do you understand? So we are going to increase the value. Right. So add taxes on products, and then we are going to subtract subsidies on products. Why are we subtracting subsidies on products? Why are we subtracting subsidies on products? Because the subsidies on products, they reduce the value of goods on the market. Are we together? If the government says brown bread is healthier, So we are going to subsidize brown bread. So what it would mean is you are going to buy the bread cheaper on the market as a way of trying to encourage you to buy more of that bread. Are we together there? So subsidies on products are being subtracted because they make the products cheaper on the market. And taxes on products are being added because they make the products more expensive on the market. Understood? When you add your taxes on products, you subtract your subsidies on products, the answer that you get is what is called the gross domestic product at market prices. The answer that you get is what is called the gross domestic product at, in other words, the GDP at market prices. It's called the GDP at market prices. Remember when we looked at our expenditure method, we said that the answer that we get eventually is also called GDP at market prices. That's all. In other words, this is the price of goods and services in the shops. When you go to buy the goods and services, that's the value of those goods and services. So that's what gives us the GDP at market prices. And then we have the income method. Now, with our income method, I'm not going to look at the income method in detail now, but I will just try to introduce it so that you understand. Our income method, dear learners, it looks at the amount of money that was received by owners of factors of production in the economy. In other words, this is the total income that they've received. Our total income that we have received, we have 4 factors of production that we have looked at earlier on. Is that correct? What are the 4 factors of production? Let's name them. Natural resources, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And all these 4 factors of production, they have their rewards. Like labor, it earns what? Salaries and wages, isn't it? Then we also have our land, it earns what? Rent, isn't it? It earns our rent. Then we also have the capital interest. Is that correct? Right? And then the last one, it earns profit. Are we together? Right. So these 4, they are all earned by households, because households, remember in our circular flow, we said they are the owners of the factors of salaries and wages. We call compensation paid to employees. A salary or a wage is a compensation that is paid to an employee. So we have salaries and wages to appear as compensation paid to employees. We have the rent, we have the, and we also have the profit. But our profit normally to appear as net operating surplus. Now, these are the components that we then look at when we are looking at our income method. But let's just quickly look at how we convert the GDP to GNP. Now, when we looked at GDP, we said gross domestic product looks at the total value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of the country over a period of 1 year. So within the borders of a country. In other words, everything else that is produced, if I take this to be my country, okay, anything else that is produced here, it feeds to the GDP. As long as it was produced within the borders, it feeds onto our GDP. Now, inside the country, we are going to have citizens and non-citizens. So our GDP does not look at whether this production was done by citizens or was done by non-citizens. It ignores that. As long as the production was done within the borders of a country. It means in the value for GDP, it includes citizens who are in the country and non-citizens who are in the country. As long as they have produced, it adds on to the GDP. Then, it also ignores something. There are certain people who are citizens but are not staying in the country. They are staying outside the country. For example, we can have a footballer who is playing soccer in Europe. That amount of money that that person is earning there, that is not included in our GDP. Yet it's income that was earned by our country. Because that person who is playing soccer there is going to support the family back home. So what do we now need to do? We now need to be able to convert this GDP to GNP. Now our GNP, it looks at, it's called gross national product. In other words, this is the total value of all final goods and services produced by citizens, regardless of where they are. So it doesn't take care of where you are. As long as you are a citizen. Are you a citizen? Yes. Then how much was the value of your output? Then we value that. So in trying to convert this, remember now, we said we could be having some nationals that are in the country and some nationals are outside the country. So what do we now need to do? It means we need to subtract from this GDP, we need to subtract contribution that was made by non-citizens. Those people that are in South Africa who are not South Africans, their contribution needs to be subtracted. Then we are left with what? With contribution that was made by citizens who are in the country. Then, now those ones that are outside the countries, who are our citizens, bring your contributions. Then we add that together. That's how we convert GDP to GNP. Now let's look at the mathematical side of it. We are going to say GDP at market prices. GDP, maybe the value is 100,000. I'll just put this 100,000, right? Then we are going to add plus factor income and abroad by South Africans, plus factor income abroad by citizens. Factor income and abroad by citizens. Okay? Any income that they earn. If a citizen who is in the country, he has some businesses that are outside the country, the income that they earn, any income that they earn, as long as they are South Africans, we add it. And then we less factor income and by citizens staying in South Africa. The answer that you get is what we call GNP. Good luck in your studies. Thank you.